Hello.
Hey, everybody.
Uh, Welcome to Writing Excuses, the live Patreon Q&A. It is longer than 15 minutes. We're here for a whole hour with y'all. Let's see. Howard, I'm getting a little bit of an echo. Are you hearing
Yep,
that?
that's because I clicked on the YouTube link and that was fun. I have now closed the YouTube link
Excellent.
because that seemed sensible.
That does make sense. I like to have it up as like some kind of like security blanket to make sure that it's actually live and working.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
it
me
looks like
too.
we are good to go. Um, yeah, so we have a few people starting to trickle in. So we'll give everyone a couple minutes to get here. But in the meantime, Howard, how are you? How are you? How's life
I'm
been
doing pretty
post
well. I have a
cruise?
question. I have a question for you. It
Yeah,
is
what's up?
how long did you play drunk or not on boat after we got home from the cruise?
Oh, it was probably a solid 3 days for me. I usually adjust pretty
Wow.
quickly, but it was still catching me for a few days afterwards. So, what about you?
Literally 0 days, 0 minutes. I got off the ship and was like, okay, where's the wobble? And my body was like, screw wobble. We got way other things, too many other things to worry about. No.
Your brain was interested in processing all the other things
Yeah, my
going on.
my inner ear
Yeah,
was like, hey guys, I have this cool idea. And my brain was like, no.
yeah. For those of you joining us who have not experienced this, we do the annual Writing Excuses workshop and retreat. It happens on a cruise ship. A thing that happens on the cruise ship is that you get sea legs, which means that you just become acclimated to the movement of the ship over time. When you get off the ship, your brain does not suddenly decide that, oh, we're on land now. We don't have to do that anymore. And it continues to make you feel as if you're on a boat moving on the water, even though you're on solid ground. So, yeah, the game that we call Drunk or Boat, which is when you can't tell what's going on, continues even after you get off the boat, which is very exciting. Um, okay. Howard, should we get to some questions?
Yeah, I'm trying to open up the live chat. I
Yes.
pulled up the YouTube on my phone.
The You should be able to see the chat in StreamYard.
Oh
If you
gosh.
go to the comments tab, it should aggregate from Facebook. And so, yes, Clinton, we are doing again next year. I don't know that we've made an official
I
announcement
see it.
of it broadly yet, but keep your eye out for that. There's a specific newsletter sign up for the cruise, so you should go to our website and grab that, and you'll learn about when we make an announcement about what the cruise is next year. But suffice to say, we are very, very excited about what we have planned. New destination, new guests, new everything. So we are, I at least am very stoked about it. So
I'm
you should,
excited. I'm looking forward to it.
yeah, it's always a good time. I look forward to it every year.
Now I need to
Okay.
do that technical magic of YouTube is in one tab, or not YouTube, StreamYard's in one tab, and the Q&A is in another tab, and I need to... It's a good thing I've got more than one monitor.
Likewise, the multiple monitors is a blessing.
Oh my goodness. All right.
Okay.
You're driving. Where's which one should we start with?
Let's start at the top of what we have here. So the question is this is from someone named Ricky. I want to emulate quote vibes, aesthetics, essence unquote of other media that I really enjoy into my writing. One specific example is the Wanderlust style. My favorite example is the movie Secret Life of Walter Mitty or the song Old Pine by Ben Howard. For Walter Mitty, the sweeping Icelandic landscape and powerful soundtrack from the movie are what stand out to me. How do I translate something that is so audio/visual into writing? My attempts so far have fallen flat. Um, that's a really interesting question. Howard, this might be more straightforward for you as someone who puts your visuals onto the page, but I'm curious if you have thoughts about this one.
Yeah, so very, very many thoughts. But I'm going to start with this. You know how sometimes someone will talk, they're like doing wine tasting, and they will say, and then they will use your words to describe the wine, and you're like, what even, how can the wine have a narrative? You know, what is this smoky that you speak of? How are you describing this? There's this thing that we do all the time where we describe a thing that we're experiencing in terms of other senses. If you listen to a piece of music and you're like, oh, I love this. It feels like it's telling a story. Okay, that's cool. That's something we can work with. What does that mean to you? Is it the call and response of of a leitmotif? Is it a repeated thing like? And I used this example in the class that I taught at WXR. The first movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, that bum 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 bum, we do a whole variation on that for that whole movement of three shorts and one long in minor keys, in major keys, in fast repetition, in long stretched out bits, to the point that the listener can't forget that that is a thing that was present. How do you work that into your writing? Well, I don't want to suggest that you just repeat yourself a lot over and over and over and over and over again in the chapter, but there are things that you can do. For instance, the use of white space. If someone says something dramatic and you set off that line of dialogue with white space, every time that happens, you are training the reader to recognize white space means drama or whatever. I mean, there's a million different ways to connect these things, but it begins with taking the thing that you want to emulate and using your words to describe it to yourself, to describe what it is that's evoking these things. The example, the movie The Secret Life of Walter Mitty with the sweeping Icelandic landscape. Okay, sweeping Icelandic landscape. Those are three very evocative words. Sweeping, big. Icelandic, cold with volcanoes. And landscape, not portrait. We can work. You can work with that. Expound and expand on that, and find out what you mean when you say, "I want to evoke that." I just watched an episode of New Amsterdam where the Indian doctor, I forget his name, the female patient says, "I'm dizzy, fix it." And he says, "Tell me what you mean by dizzy." "I'm dizzy. You know what dizzy means. I can't help you until you tell me what it means." By the end of the episode, he says, "If you're dizzy, you should just tell me what you mean, or leave." She says, "I can't leave. Every time I try to get up, I can't feel my feet and I fall down." And he said, "Aha! Now I know what dizzy means." And he gave her a diagnosis. So Dongwon disappeared. I don't know what happened. I'm going to pull up Discord.
I'm back.
You're back. I was terrified.
Yeah, very unclear what happened there, but it just suddenly decided that I should not be in the StreamYard anymore.
Anyway, I could
Anyways.
talk and talk and talk about this because I love it so much. Because I came to this world from I was a music major, and I'm an illustrator, and I'm a writer, and so all of these things. There are pictures that evoke stories, that evoke songs, that evoke smells and tastes and all of that. And it's fun.
Yeah, I think all of that is like incredibly useful advice, or at least the parts of it that I heard. I lost the last bit there, but I think coming at it from my side, what I would say is to kind of boil it down to the essence, right? I think a little bit what's happening is it sounds like you're trying to replicate some surface level things in terms of like the imagery or the sonic landscape, instead of trying to tap into what the emotional core of the thing is, right? So To show an example, kind of going in the opposite direction, I was thinking about the adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House by that was on Netflix some years ago, the Mike Flanagan show. In It's a really useful example because on paper it is an extremely different story with a different layout, different characters, all these things, but there are tonal things that he pulled through from one to the other that I think really are the things that make it feel like a Hill House story, even though it has a very different arc and very different emotional climax and all of these things. So what I would want you to do is think about, like, how is this song making you feel? How is this movie making you feel? How is, like, what's your emotional reaction to those elements? And then how can you recreate that, right? So don't try to replicate the sweeping vista, replicate the sense of scale and scope that your character is experiencing, rather than the specific end result of it. So, I think all the tools that Howard is giving you are really useful ones. And then if you can apply those to the emotional core that you're seeking, I think you might have a little bit more luck trying to execute on the thing that you're trying to do. Matching a different tone is a difficult thing. Zeroing in on that voice, zeroing in on that imagery is always a challenge. So, my other thing is just keep trying until you find the right thing. Just try different approaches, use different styles, different POVs, really switch it up until you stumble across the thing that works and gets you the vibe you're looking for. So good luck. Okay. This is a really good one, actually, given that we're just coming back from our own conference and that we've sort of talked about the utility conferences in general. So the advice is given, the advice that we give a lot is to attend conferences. The question asker says they sound wonderful, but they are so expensive. And the local ones are $400 or so to attend. How would you weigh their importance and value for a part-time aspiring author who doesn't have a large budget? Really, really great question, and one that I think about a lot. And one reason I almost hesitate to recommend conferences as a way to go sometimes. Obviously, we run our own. We think they're useful in certain ways, but there's a reason we do what we call workshops instead of conferences. And there are gradations in the types of events out there, right? So a writing workshop is one that's going to be more focused on craft. It's going to be a smaller group. And then a writing conference is usually a very large group that happens over a shorter time period, 2 or 3 days, that brings in lots of agents, lots of editors, and lots of guests. And that is a much larger scale event. And then conventions are the thing that happen more in the SFF space, which are often, if not fan-driven events, at least include fans. And then, of course, there's the Comic-Cons, which is its own kind of subset, which are massive events of hundreds of thousands of people that are more media-oriented events, right? So first off, just like having a handle on the taxonomy of those different things and what's going to be useful to you is an important thing to approach and figure out what makes the most sense for you. In terms of utility, the two that I think are the best bang for your buck is a writing workshop, because you'll get a lot of like skills out of that. It's the biggest investment usually in terms of time and money, because they're often a week, sometimes 6 weeks, right? And they can be quite expensive. But you will also form much deeper bonds with your fellow classmates and like meet people who you can grow your career with over time. Writing SFF cons, like conventions, are great for networking. You'll meet a lot of people in your genre, in your space. Romance also has these, horror has these. If you're writing literary fiction, a little bit harder to get to. There's a few of them, but not as popular. So cons can still be expensive. You still have to get a hotel often, or if you're going to a local one. If you're going to a local one, don't tell anyone I recommended this, but you can also just show up and go to the bar, hang out in the lobby, and meet people that way. We call that bar conning it. It is frowned upon by the con organizers for a number of reasons, because it costs a lot to put these events on. And if you're not contributing to that, that causes problems for them. That said, depending on the event, depending on the scale, depending on your budget, sometimes it makes sense to bar con it instead of registering for the full show. I am quite down on writing conferences. I think they promise a lot and deliver very little, and they are probably the most expensive out of the things that we're listing right now. There are a couple that are good. I love Surrey International Writers Conference. We have friends who help run that. I think they have a really strong focus on education that puts them a cut above, in my opinion. But even that is kind of borderline of, is it worth it for the dollars that you spend, especially if you're an American, would have to fly to Canada for that one. So writers conferences, I don't love them. I don't do many of them anymore. I think pitch sessions with agents and those kind of things are, I think they give the wrong impression of what value you as a writer are going to get. You're not going to go to a writers conference and get a deal out of it. It happens once in a blue moon, but I think having that expectation is not very helpful. I do think there's some useful classes that can happen there. A lot of that information is available online or through classes that individual editors and agents are giving on their own platforms, or a platform like this one. So, in general, that's my overall advice. Workshops, if you can afford it and you have the time. Cons, if you can't and you work in the genre space. And then I would generally stay away from conferences unless you really, really want to go for a very specific reason. Just know that bang for your buck is probably lowest on that scale there. And Comic Cons basically aren't useful for this, unless you happen to have friends who can get you into the right parties, into the right events to meet the people. They're just so big, and you're meeting so many people at them that you're not going to get useful networking done there. Yeah. So when we on the podcast really talk about networking at events, we're mostly talking about cons like Worldcon, Nebulas, your local Armadillo Con, whatever it happens to be.
Let me approach the answer from a different angle. Mm-hmm. At the end of the Writing Excuses cruise, we told everybody, and we tell them this every year, the single most valuable thing that they get out of it is the relationships they have with their peers, with fellow attendees. So are there ways for you, without going to a conference, to connect with peers who write? And I used this phrase years and years ago, and it stuck with me. Charisma is not a dump stat. Learning to identify yourself as a writer and as someone who is friendly is often a great way to just meet someone, whether it's on the street or in a chat room or whatever. I don't know where you people hang out, but identifying as a writer is one way to meet other writers, because there's this instant magnetism. Oh wait, you write? What do you write? Stop it. Be confident. Oh, I'm working on a science fiction trilogy right now. I'm stuck in the middle of book 2. Oh, that sounds amazing. I write romance. Really? You make these connections and learn people's names and develop the relationship. What's going to grow out of it? I don't know. We never know. But there are ways to work on meeting people that don't involve paying money to go to where high concentrations of those people are hanging out.
Exactly.
Way more work? Yes, way more work.
Yeah. You can do all of these things for free. You don't have to pay to go to a con. If you can afford it, I think it's a useful thing to do. But like Howard was saying, there are other ways to network. There's other ways to meet people. And even if you are going to cons, things that I would encourage you to do those things anyways, to find online community, find local community. Those things make a huge difference in your career, and I think to your sense of self as you pursue a writing career. Cool. Howard, do you want to pick the next question?
Oh, sure. Do you have any tips for writing romance as a subplot in a fresh way? It seems like the kind of thing that's been done a million times, so there are so many cheesy tropes and pitfalls that readers can see through. Excellent question. I'd like to point out that if there are so many cheesy tropes and pitfalls, if it's been done a million times, you have a million possible ways to model this just from what you've seen. And everything is trope-tastic and cheesy if you don't file the serial numbers off, if you don't, learn what made it work and make it your own.
Yeah, I think my basic thing is there's no new thing under the sun, right? Especially when it comes to writing. If it's been done a million times, that is why there are reasons why it's been done a million times, and that's because it works, quite frankly. People want romance plots to follow they hit certain markers, they hit certain milestones, to have certain tropes. People enjoy that about it. Now, when it feels cheesy, it's not because it's following the tropes, it's because it's not adding enough texture or variation or difference to it to make it feel exciting and rich, I think. So my the thing that I would say is to really focus on specificity. So you can have the arc, you can have the beats, but then lean really hard into what do your individual characters think and feel? What makes them distinct? What about their history? What about who they are? What about their perspective? What about their connection with each other is going to add that extra seasoning, that extra spice, that extra difference between what you've seen before and what it is in this case, right? Whenever we see an exciting romance in a TV show or a movie, we know what this plot is. We know, hey, this person's attracted to this person, and that's going to be interesting and exciting and fun. And we know the general arc of that. They're going to like have an exciting thing. They're going to feel a connection. They're going to make out. They're going to feel weird about it, or they'll decide to go forward with it, right? Like it'll succeed or it won't, right? We know the branching decision points. What makes it so powerful to us is being like, oh my gosh, this person in this moment feels this way about that person who has this experience, right? So it's worry less about whether or not this has been done before and worry more about what it is that your characters and only your characters think and feel, because
Yeah,
it's
there's
all been done.
I'm gonna I'm gonna use a terrible example of romance because I'm not using it as an example of romance. The opening romp in a James Bond movie, where
Mhm.
we see James Bond doing awesome, amazing things straight out of the gate, and because the opening credits, because the ticket we're holding says I've come to a James Bond movie, James Bond has already earned this. Other movies that try to, or stories that try to open with an action romp, often fall flat because even though the action unfolds just like it would for James Bond, the character hasn't earned it for us yet.
Mhm.
So if you are if you are looking at the trope and saying, "Oh, it just doesn't work for me," or this delivery of it doesn't work for me, sometimes it's because the characters haven't earned it yet.
Yeah.
You've got a meet cute. Well, meet cute is one of my favorite tropes. But if it falls flat, then well, what was missing? They didn't they didn't earn it. It felt forced that they were meeting,
Mhm.
or there wasn't a reason for them to lock eyes and have a moment. What do you write in order to make them earn it? I don't know. If that was
It might
something
be
that we could do with a
diagnostic
cookie
of,
cutter, if that was
yeah.
something we could do with a cookie cutter, then we'd do it with a
Yeah.
cookie cutter. And yeah,
Yeah. I like this idea of that falling flat is a diagnostic of other story problems, right? Because it might mean that you need more backstory for your character, that you might need to amp up the sense of investment in them, in this, or the stakes are flat, or the world building's not there. Whatever it is that's either driving your characters together or keeping them apart, that's a thing that might be missing in the story, and that's not driving your romance to be as satisfying as you want it to be. Um, okay. So, next question. How do you write descriptions so that space feels big and well defined? Um, Parentheses, interior rooms, courtyards, Great Plains, Mongolia, wide open spaces. Everything I try comes out feeling smallish or super vague and fuzzy. Um, Great question. Howard, do you have thoughts on this one?
I do. We talk a lot about making sure that our descriptions use multiple senses. I years and years ago, we were recording a pipe organ in a big chapel. Big, big. I say chapel as a cathedral, Cathedral of the Madeleine in Salt Lake City. What are some things that make a cathedral feel big? Well, you can look. up and you can look around and you can see that things are far away. But one of the things that makes it feel big, especially when it's empty, is that the sound of your footsteps comes back to you after kind of a long time, and it echoes kind of a long time. A the other audio engineer and I were troubleshooting a microphone problem, and we stopped and waited for the sound of the door slam, the sound of our footsteps to die, and that waiting for those echoes to go away
Mhm.
made the room feel huge. And then we found the problem. The air handling unit had turned on and was doing straight at our microphone. But so those sorts of things. Can you smell something, or can you not smell something? You know, you see smoke, but you can't smell it. Well, that's probably a long way off. Or there's a really strong wind. Wait, there's a really strong wind. That's a thing that you can feel. That's something, not something you technically you typically feel in a small room. So use those other senses to expand expand our experience of the big space you're writing for
Mhm.
us.
I love that leaning into sensory detail, right? The way it sounds, the way it smells, the way air moves in it, all those things going to help you just really define how big the space is. The other thing I want you to think about is how people use the space, right? The physicality of the people in the space, how they arrive on the scene, how they leave the scene, right? It takes a long time for someone to walk across a cathedral to get to you. You see them coming, you have time to examine them, you can observe their gait. Give your characters time and space to take in what they're seeing versus a smaller space. It might feel rushed or more abrupt, a character appearing, right? Someone pops out of a doorway versus like the door opens and you see them walking towards you for a long time, right? I'm thinking about Lord of the Rings. When they are pursuing the hobbits across the plains of Rohan, we get such long, long sequences of those poor bastards running over and over and over again. Different sweeping shots, different helicopter shots, and it feels like it goes on for a long time because in the character's experience, it is. They are doing a difficult thing. They are running for a whole day straight or whatever it happens to be over an enormous amount of distance. And so they're communicating that distance by showing us the physicality of them you moving across that space, right? So you can do that yourself by giving us some opportunity to observe people, how they use the space. Are they seeing something in the distance, right? Are they, seeing dust in the distance and that signals a rider approaching? Can they see the sun setting or rising in a certain way, right? All of those things. So think about the physicality of the space, think about your sensory experience of the space, and then think about how people interact with a space that large and what is different about interacting with a large space versus a small space. And those might just give you the little clues that will let you lock into a really solid description.
The question mentioned, now I need to look back at it, so I'm looking at the actual question. Great Plains, Mongolia, wide open spaces.
Mhm.
How far away, assuming as perfectly flat as Earth allows landscape to be, if you're standing, how far away can you see another person who is standing? And I think the answer is like around 12 miles. Might be much less than that. Um, the idea that if you can see a thunderstorm, it's uh, you know maybe 15 or 20 miles off, but there's weather that's coming to you that you can't see because it's over the horizon, and yet it will reach you today.
Mhm.
It's fun to do. It's fun to do the math on those sorts of things, or just you know look it up on the internet and figure out what how far you can see things over the horizon. Because these are things that people who don't typically do long overland or long ocean travel things aren't aware of. And so you
Yeah.
can have a character who just doesn't know, and the other character says, "Yeah, I know that mountain looks like it's right here, but
Mhm.
uh, it's not. You're only seeing the top of it, and it's 10,000 feet above the
Mhm.
ground. So we still have another 50 miles."
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important concept is like how we experience the world in that way in terms of like Yeah, I mean, anybody who spent time in different parts of the country, weather in New York is always a surprise because you can't see what's coming at you. It just shows up, right? So things feel more abrupt here versus, when you're out west, you can see it coming from ways off. You can feel that approach. You get a sense of the weather turning earlier than when it arrives. Um, so all those things do, I think, make quite a difference. But I love that we have an actual meteorologist in the chat. I hope we haven't said anything wildly off base.
Oh, I'm always so very, very wrong, uh, and
Yeah, it's all Howard's
I
fault.
love when my cousin corrects me.
You want to take the next one?
Yes. Hi guys, it has an exclamation point right there, so I gotta say it that way. Hi guys, I'm a pantser turned plotter, and though it makes marvels to my writing, hello, endings that make sense, I'm missing the adventurous fun of not knowing where I'm going. Also, it makes my actual writing slower and harder. Do you have tips for me? Thanks like always. Smiley face. Um, I have good news and bad news. The good news is um, there is always adventure and fun in discovery in the writing. Sometimes it's when you're working on the outline. Sometimes it's when you're writing character dialogue and you realize, oh, that's what they'd say, and you get that thrill of, having written something true to the voice or clever or evocative or whatever. The bad news is whether you are discovery writing, whether you are writing to an outline, at some point, if you are writing for a market, you probably need to revise, and revision is is made out of the grinding of I know exactly what happens next, and after that, and after that, and after that. There is no discovery here except the discovery of typos and superfluous free range commas and whatever else. So learn learn to love parts of the slog, because there will still be some fun discovery in there. When I outline things, there is a certain thrill to putting the pieces together and realizing, aha, that's how this arc works. And then I'll make notes to myself about what the characters probably need to do in order to support that. And then on my first prose pass, there's some of those same aha moments. Oh, that's exactly what they'd say. And I get that thrill of discovery. But eventually it comes down to craft and repetition and grind and doing the hard, slow parts.
Yeah. I think the other thing I would add to that, you know, we're always having this conversation about Panzer versus Plotter and, treat them as like two very distinct modes of thinking about fiction and thinking about craft. And I wish we were a little bit more nuanced in this conversation in general, right? I understand where the framework comes from, but the reality is, in my experience of watching, dozens of writers write their books and evolve their careers, and first book versus third book versus 10th book, is the difference. People often start out as a pantser or a plotter, but over time they tend to combine both strategies into something much more hybridized and much more flexible depending on the project. Some projects will require a lot of plotting, and some projects you can have like a one-page outline and then just be very loose with it, and it's more discovery process, right? Some drafts will be a pantser draft and then will require plotting in the revision, and sometimes you'll go in with a really rigid plot and be like, woof, this thing's a little lifeless, let's go back in and inject some you know uh, some of that unpredictability adventure to it, right? And I've seen the same writer apply three different techniques in three books. So if you're missing some of that adventure, then ease off a little bit on the amount of plotting that you're doing, right? Like, make your outline half as long, make it more bullet points. You're staking points out on the field, right? Like, And then you're not actually necessarily laying out, here's the 10 things that happen in this chapter. He's like, okay, at the end of this section, I need them to be here so that this sets up the final reveal, which I want to be this. And then how they get to that point is less important than having every detail nailed down. So if you're finding it kind of a grind, then ease off a little bit on the plotting. That doesn't mean you're going to lose that ability to execute on the ending that you wanted. And also, there's a chance that just having done it a few times, having worked to an outline, having done more of that plotting, you'll have exercised that muscle enough that when you go back to pantsing, it'll be easier to make sure it feels coherent in the end, right? Sometimes just like learning how to do it once or twice is enough to make sure that when you are trying to pants your way through something, you have the skills to make it smoother in the long run, if that makes sense. So ultimately, think less about pantser versus plotter and instead find ways to take tools from both strategies that work for you and give you the kind of joy you're looking for in the writing, but also enough structure that you're not just wandering off into the wilderness. Okay. All right, next question. This is an interesting one. I consider myself persistent. I learned Japanese, got a doctorate, have spent 10 years honing my writing. I've been in the query trenches with the space opera project for 10 months. I've gotten personalized rejections and a full request to the agent passed, but I'm concerned that I'm killing the novel's chances in the current brutal climate. Post-COVID flood of queries to agents, a select few agents interested in sci-fi, let alone space opera, layoffs in publishing, the acquisition of SNS, AI craziness, the list goes on. I know there's no simple answer, but I'm wondering if y'all can discuss query timing strategy. This is from Kara.
Can I read what I wrote in the spreadsheet?
Howard says, I got nothing beyond the usual quote, don't try to write to the market, end quote, which is accurate. Query timing is a really interesting question. And I see it come up sometimes. And I understand all of this anxiety about what's going on in publishing right now. I've been in publishing 18 years at this point, 19 years, something like that. There is no point in my career that publishing has not been about to die, according to all the discourse around it, right? It's always something is about to completely destabilize publishing and it's all going to collapse. And I'm not saying that can't not happen at some point in the future. It's possible that publishing will disappear one day. But the list of things that we're up against now, I feel to me more like in a long line of trends that we have seen over time, and that we're going to continue to see. It will always feel dire to be in the books business because it's a little bit the nature of the business, right? So don't worry too much about the overall climate of publishing when you're looking to query, right? There isn't really a post-COVID flood of queries. That's not exactly happening. We're always seeing a lot of queries, or we're always in a drought, often at the same time. Depends on the genre, depends on the agent, depends on the category, right? The thing to remember is you don't need a bunch of agents to say yes. You just need to hit with the right person. Now, the most salient thing that you're running into here is that not many agents do adult science fiction and fantasy. It's a very small sector. We don't have many publishers. We've got 5 big 5 publishers and then 3 or 4 major sort of mid-sized independents, right? It's a tight area. You can fit all of the people who do adult SFF into one bar at one time. It's probably going to happen in about 3 weeks during New York Comic Con, right? Like this is a thing that happens with some regularity. There's not that many of us. I know all of them by first name, right? Which makes it a fun space to work in some ways, but it is tough when you're querying that science fiction project that if you strike out with all the usual suspects, that it can get kind of tough to find a new person. Now, there's always new people coming on the field. There's always new agents coming up, people trying to break into the field. There's always the person who maybe doesn't work in this space primarily, but loves your project, falls in love with it. All of that said, sometimes you query a project and it doesn't find an agent, right? More than sometimes. It happens to most people. That doesn't mean that you are done. That doesn't mean you've wasted your chances. It just means that you need to move on to the next project, right? And that can be hard to hear, and it can be really frustrating. But you never know what tomorrow's going to bring. You never know what that next project is going to look like, and it might hit with the right audience, with the right agent, better than the first one did. And if you got a full request and that agent passed, then you can go back to the new project being like, hey, you wanted to see it the last time, you liked it, you said these nice things about it, would you be open to seeing this new project that hopefully is a little bit more up your alley, right? um, there's a lot of random chance in this business that comes down to business climate, political climate, ask Mary Robin about what it's like to publish your book in an election year, right? Like, there's a lot of things that can happen that can derail your either sending out a query or trying to get your book published that has nothing to do with you and nothing to do with the general timing. And so don't try to overthink it. Don't try to game it too much. The only things I'm going to say is, in general, stay away from the holidays and stay away from late summer. Those are the two times that publishing is truly just checked out. You know, August and then November and December, people are not reading, they're not paying attention. Every now and again, an agent will be like, no, send it to me then because I'm not busy. I'm looking to look at stuff. I think that's the minority. I think most people are just basically checked out at those times. So in terms of when you're going to send a query in, that's the only consideration I take into account. Don't worry too much about the cycle. Other than that, Howard's right. Don't write to the market. You just kind of write the best book you can, write the best query you can, take your shot. And if it doesn't work out, pick yourself up, move on to the next project, and just keep going. And just because it's in a drawer now doesn't mean it's not going to come back later, right? You sell maybe the third project you pitch, and then books 1 and 2 are still in that drawer. You can bring them up and be like, hey, for my next project, I'd love to publish this one. I really believed in it. Can you help me figure out why it didn't land last time and how we can find the right audience now? So ultimately, don't get discouraged. Don't pay too much attention to what's going on in the news. Like, publishing is publishing. It's always going to be doing some wild nonsense. And there's still always the opportunity to get your book out there and find the audience you are looking for. So
I think now's a good time to ask the question, or to pose the question for you to ask yourselves, which is, am I writing because I love to write, or am I writing because I want to write this thing?
yeah.
And because if after years and years of querying and submitting and whatever else, nobody wants that thing, do you want to keep writing? Do you want to try writing something else? I don't know the answer to the question. I know that for me, I make comics and I write stories because it's something I love to do, and I will keep doing in my current genre and in other genres. I also think it's worth pointing out that for a while and it's easiest to point to Hollywood because it's so visual. For a while in Hollywood, it was cowboy movies everywhere. It was westerns, and then that dried up for a while, and then Quigley Down Under and Silverado landed, and the market was like, "Oh my goodness, we're making cowboy movies again." Well, not really, but we made those movies because they were quite good. Pirates of the Caribbean. The prior to that point, I think the big pirate movie was Cutthroat Island, which was a huge bomb. And yeah, Hollywood looked at, you're going to make a pirate movie? No, wait, an actual pirate about a Disney ride? Why would you do that? Point being, maybe nobody's interested in your space opera right now, but that doesn't mean that the market isn't going to turn on a dime and suddenly they want space opera the way they wanted sparkling vampires 15 years ago.
Also, Kara, don't tell anyone I ever said this. This isn't on stream or recorded in any way. But if I were to bet on a category coming back, I would currently bet on space opera and epic fantasy. So I think you are well positioned for a resurgence. Okay. Howard, do you want to do the next one?
I will go ahead and read this one. How do you separate the idea of your characters? Sorry. How do you separate the idea of your characters from the real people you know that they are loosely based on, especially if the association is bad. I have a terrible boss character, a scam artist character, two awful in laws characters, and those are dragging up a lot of baggage for me, obviously. But worst of all is the perfect soldier character, who is more or less a friend of mine who was killed horribly in Iraq. I've signed myself up for trauma therapy, which seemed like a really necessary step, but is there anything I can do on the writing side? I want to lead by I want to lead with two things. One, yes, getting therapy is good because while writing can be part of a solid cognitive behavioral therapy strategy, it can't be the only strategy, especially if there's real deep seated stuff going on. And the second thing is that you might be using the phrase loosely based differently than I would. Because if writing a character who is loosely based on someone else brings up horrible memories of that other person, I'd say they're not loosely based. They're kind of tightly locked in. And the solution might be to loosen them up a lot, to give them attributes, give them scenarios, give them whatever that distances them from the source material.
Um, Sorry, I was responding to a comment, so I lost the last bit of that you said. But I think it's a really interesting question, and a constant challenge, right? I mean, there's multiple reasons why you do want to split up who the fictional character is from the person that it's based on. One of those reasons is litigation. You don't want to get sued. Getting sued is not fun for these kind of issues. I have a friend who really got dragged through it, ended up the book got pulled, and then eventually got back on the shelves after she won her case. But like, it took a long time. It was very expensive, very difficult, right? So you want to be very careful about making sure that things are too one-to-one. The other reason you want to be careful around it is exactly the thing that you brought up here, which is sometimes those things can be very, very close to your experience and can really cut very deeply into very tender territory, right? Being in therapy I cannot recommend it enough for literally every person, but especially if you're a writer, especially if you're a creator and you're digging into some of those darker topics. The better you take care of yourself, the better position you're going to be in to write truly great fiction. The better you understand yourself, the better you're going to be able to mine those difficult times and difficult subjects for material that you can process in an exciting way. So I'm glad to hear that you are at least addressing that side. But the closer it is to the thing that you experience, the harder it's going to hit you. And so I would try and find ways to shake it up a little bit. Another thing that sort of raises a little bit of a red flag for me in the way that you're talking about it is if it's too close to your own personal experience, it's not as exciting as it will be in fiction, right? Because it'll be too close. Reality makes terrible stories, right? The way things happen and the way we
Especially
experience
this timeline.
especially this timeline, the way things happen and the way we experience it from our own POV is often just like a really flat way for a story to be written because it's not being written, right? Because writing is as much removing things and highlighting certain aspects and dramatizing certain things as it is anything else, right? So if your character is too close to who the actual person was, or even worse, too close to just your idea of who that person was, then it's not going to feel as authentic, ironically, to your readers as if it were something that was more of a construct, right? So I would encourage you to try as much as possible to step away. You can use your friend, your experience as the kernel of it, and then try and grow in a different direction. Try and push yourself to be like, okay, I have this idea of this person as a perfect soldier. This was my friend. I idealized them in certain ways. How do I step away from that? How do I change the description, physical, emotional, whatever those things are, and then really think about, okay, what does it mean that this person was born a black person versus a white person if your friend was white, right? Like, and just like lean into those differences. Or, what does it mean that this person had a horrible temper, and how did that change the experience that they went through, and all of those things, right? Give them flaws that are interesting and nuanced, and then think hard about what consequences having those flaws would have. And as you go through that process, as you add more things, as you layer on more elements, you will find at the end of the day, you have a character who maybe is emotionally or thematically filling the same certain space, but the person feels very different. And that's going to be a rich and textured experience for your readers, and a safer space for you as the writer to have that distance to do the things that you need to do as a writer, to your characters. Unfortunately, creators are not always the most generous to the characters, because they need to go through certain things for us to see the story and for us to enjoy the story. So building that separation in, I think, will just makes for a better experience for all of us. Yeah.
The the terrible boss character. It occurred to me that I've had some terrible bosses, different lifetime, but yeah. If you take the terrible boss character and just give us someone who is an awful boss, and then something bad happens to them, that might be therapeutic for you. It might be worth writing, but it's not nearly so satisfying as if our first introduction to the boss character is what we like to call competence porn. This person is super competent at a thing, and we see them being awesome, and we're like, oh, I like that fella. He's awesome. And then we see them being cruel, and then we see them micromanaging,
Mm-hmm.
and then we see them stepping out on their spouse or whatever. Now we have an emotional attachment, and like, oh no, oh, this person turned out to be awful. I hope they turn it around. Nope, they don't turn it around. Something terrible happens to them. Well, now you've got an emotional arc, and you've invested me in that character. And for your own part, you had to write terrible boss character as someone who had good traits
Yeah.
so that we could like them, which might actually be a valid therapeutic technique. But don't quote me on anything like that, because I'm not your therapist or anyone else's.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's always an important thing is consider, people are people. Even the worst people, have some redeeming quality or some appealing quality, right? Whether it's, I mean, the scam artist character that you have, like, they're going to be charming in a certain way. They're going to be interesting or magnetic in a certain way. What Being able to access what about them makes them a human, what makes them an interesting person with real flaws, I think are going to be the things that are going to make this stand out just as a reading experience, and separate you from either blowback from people who might recognize themselves in your story, um, or um, and again, just keep it a more interesting story overall. So yeah, like Howard is saying, if you have a terrible boss character, if you have a villain, don't let them just be a one note villain. Give them something good about themselves, right? Whether it's the competence porn thing Howard's talking about, or just, I don't know, make them really like dogs, right? Like, just give them some aspect that is something iconically kind or generous, or maybe they're a really good parent or a really loving partner, but just horrendous in the office. And then the other thing is, think about, why are they like this, right? What is the thing that has driven them to be terrible to their employees? What is driving them internally to treat other people the way that they are? It might still make them a bad person. It doesn't justify that behavior. But if you understanding it as clearly as possible about where they're coming from in their own experience, I think will let you present a character on the page that is so nuanced and textured that people aren't going to have that knee jerk reaction to it.
I skipped a question. When you asked me to read a question, I skipped over one.
Yes, that is because it is a question for Aaron, and you and I are both not
No,
suited to
there's
answer.
there's one below it. It's
Oh,
from September 19th.
oh yeah, we did
And
miss
that
that
was
one.
exactly what happened. I was like, oh, that's right. I'm supposed to skip that one because it's for Aaron.
Yes. Why don't you read that one, and then we'll
I
answer
will.
that, and then we will be done.
Well, yeah. We'll answer it and then we can be done.
Yes.
Sometimes when I read a book or watch a movie, I'm super enjoying when all of a sudden I pause and I think, where in the world is this going? Sometimes the goal has already been met. Other times I know what they want, but I can't figure out why they're doing what they're doing. How do you avoid this? I feel like this is two possible questions. Question number one is, how do I avoid letting my understanding of the meta get in the way of enjoying what I'm seeing? And the second question is, how do I avoid writing things that confuse people who are familiar with the meta?
Uh, for question number one, Howard, if you have an answer to that, please let me know. Media has been ruined for me for how long did I say I've been in publishing? 18 years? Yeah. I cannot enjoy stories in the way that I used to.
Oh, I can't enjoy them in the way that I used to, but I can enjoy them. We watched some police procedurals with my soon-to-be son-in-law, and we'd never seen them. We'd never seen this series before, and Sandra and I were like, every so often be like, and killer right there. And Sandra was like,
Mhm.
yep, that's the one. And Tyler, who had seen these, turned to us like, how are you doing this? There's something in the meta. I don't know what's signaling it, but
Yeah.
that's who it is. So we have whole new games that we play now, watching things. I kind of like it when I'm watching a thing and all of a sudden I realize, nah, my understanding of the landscape of this meta is not helping me here. Am I confused? Am I tense? Am I worried for the director? I don't know, but now I'm having a different kind of adventure.
The trick that I do, or it's not even a trick, I don't mean to do this, but sometimes when I'm meeting an author and they're talking to me about their book, they'll give me the 3 sentences about their plot. I'll be like, yeah, the problem is in Act 3 when this happens, it's going to it's an unsatisfying turn because of X, Y, and Z reasons. And they're like, you haven't read my book. How do you know that was going to happen? I was like, yeah, but I've read books. I know how story goes. And so you were either going to do A, B, or C at that moment. Right. And you were saying that your problem is this like emotional thing isn't landing. So obviously you picked option C and that's why it's not working. Right.
I'm going to flag that as worst party trick ever.
It is the worst party trick ever. And, oftentimes I'm wrong too. I certainly have a very far from 100% hit record with this. And, which is why I'm like, anyways, whatever. I'm not
I love
projecting
it.
my idea of what your book is onto people. But because books are it's just made up of tropes. Any story is 100 different tropes stitched together in various patterns, right? That our brains love pattern recognition. That's what we're looking for in story. That's what we're looking to engage with. So if you've experienced enough story, if you've read enough books, watched enough movies, and thought about them very deeply in the way that creators do, editors and agents like me do, people who make movies do, then you have sort of a sixth sense about the way story is going to unfold. So for me, it's not that I can watch 10 minutes of a procedural and say, that person's the killer. What I can do, though, is tell you, here are the story beats we're probably going to see. And each of those beats, here are the 2 or 3 options that the writing team has in front of them that are the obvious paths to take, right? That's not bad. You want to be picking things from that list because if you're picking things that aren't on that list, then your audience is like, hey, this is bad. You're just doing random stuff that doesn't make sense, right? Audience expectation is a really important part of fiction, especially genre fiction. So what I think is happening here when you are saying, wait a minute, I think I know the way where the story is going and I can't figure out what they're doing. I think one of two things is happening in that moment. One is you've misread the meta in some way, that you've missed some signal that they're switching genres or changing tones. Or the other, more likely thing is that the thing that you're watching is not very well written, right? It is okay. This is a weird thing to say. It's okay to think something is bad. There's a lot of movies and TV shows that I watch that where a lot of people really love it. And I'm like, hey, this isn't good. I don't like it. And here are my reasons why, right? It doesn't mean that I think people who do like it are, wrong in some way. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion. Everyone has their own feelings about story. But for me, when I'm experiencing that feeling that you're describing, it's usually me stepping back and being like, oh, the writers screwed up some signal here, or some turn here, or this didn't land. And then for me, it becomes a fascinating exercise in trying to figure out where this went off the rails, right? And for me, it's a learning exercise of understanding, oh, here are the tools that can be applied to fix this story. It's why you get a table full of writers together, and oftentimes they will talk about a movie. And at some point, the conversation turns to the versions of the movies that they wish they could have written, right? I have plenty of these myself, right? It's a really natural instinct. And I think that happens a lot. So I think to answer sort of the second question that Howard posed, or sort of that you were asking at the end of this question, Aisha, is how do you avoid this? I think the way to avoid it is by doing the exercise that I'm talking about. Watch things. When it goes off the rails, take a step back and really think about it. Why did it feel off to you? What wasn't right there? Rewatch it. Gabrielle mentions this in the comments. If you can rewatch it later, that can be really useful to examine what went wrong exactly, right? I love watching things that are bad all the time, in part because I enjoy trash, but also because I learn a lot from it. I enjoy watching children's media because sometimes the storytelling is so much simpler in a certain way that you can pick out story problems and story solutions easier than you can in, a sophisticated indie film that is doing 18 different things at once, right? Um, Sometimes when you remove the nuance, you can learn faster than you can than when you're digging through all these layers of symbolism, right? So my advice is just to dig into that feeling. If you experience that feeling, I want you to lean in. I want you to say, "Oh, that's a weird feeling. Why am I feeling that? What's going off the rails here?" Without specific examples, I can't tell you what exactly is happening in those moments, but it's a thing that I feel all the time because, like I was saying, all of storytelling is pattern recognition. All of story appreciation is pattern recognition. So learn to pick out the patterns, learn to see the tropes, learn to figure out what are the story branching paths here, and what can you do with those, and how can you apply that in your own fiction.
Pattern recognition. There's this thing that happens to a lot of people who drive, who have, driven for years and years and years. They develop what feels like telepathy. I mean, it's happened to me. I can tell when somebody's going to change lanes before they
Mm-hmm.
use their turn signal. How's it happening? Well, there are several ways that you telegraph that you're about to change lanes. One is you think about changing lanes, and that causes you sometimes to shift the car a little
Mm-hmm.
bit, or eyes flick to mirrors. Second, you actually check your blind spot to see if there's something there. And third, and this is the one that you should do before you do any of the others, is you turn on your turn signal. In writing, there are all kinds of patterns that will be telegraphing the meta, and you need to know what they are and use all of them. I make a point when I am driving of not trying to say, I'm not going to let anybody read me. I am going to be Mr. Mentalist. I am only going to use my turn signal the moment I'm about. And no, I'm happy with people guessing what I'm about to do. I want them to know because that's how we don't
Yeah.
have car accidents.
Yeah. Exactly.
Learn what the meta is and learn those patterns
Mm-hmm.
and figure them out. Jupiter Ascending, I really did not like that movie. I really didn't like that movie. And I
It's
didn't
all
do
right,
a good
Howard. You
job of
can be wrong and alone. That is totally fine.
and I didn't do a good job of communicating that because there were people like, "How dare you hate me for hating this movie?" I'm like, "No, I don't hate you. I don't think you're dumb or simple or anything like that. I just didn't like that." I have found a new way to articulate this, and I come back to it all the time. And that is, if I don't like a thing that other people like, they win because they have a thing that they love and I don't.
Mm-hmm.
Ta-da! So yeah,
Everyone around me
if
is winning a lot these days. That's all I'll say.
I deploy that quite a lot when I'm watching it. I'm
I
like,
like
oh,
that.
that was awful. This was, and I'll tweet about it or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But then I make a point of saying, hey, but if you love it, that's awesome. You got to
Yeah.
love something that I didn't. You win.
It's as with everything, not finding a thing that you don't like, I think can be as interesting as finding a thing that you love. It's not as fun. It's not as exciting. I think you should resist the urge to like really enjoy hitting something, but I think it can be really useful to find something that you don't like and really interrogate why. And yeah, I'm with Howard. I think most of the time when you're feeling that confusion, it is somebody didn't hit their turn signal, or they only hit the turn signal and didn't do the other things that were required before. They didn't look before they changed lanes, right? It's like those kind of things. I think it's a great metaphor. It's all those things coming together that signal the change is about to happen. And if that's not properly signaled in all these different ways, then it's going to be a confusing experience for the people around you, namely your audience. And with that, I think we'll make the turn to closing this out. So thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for all the amazing questions from our Patreon subscribers. If you would like to have your question answered in a future chat, we're doing these monthly. Then subscribe, patreon.com/writing excuses. You can sign up there and submit your questions, and they'll be answered on a future stream. Apologies to those of you who tried to come to the stream last week. We had some very weird technical stuff that went down, and we're very sorry that we missed it. We are trying to do these on a consistent evening in the month, every month. So please keep a lookout for this in the future. Subscribe to our newsletter that's on our website, writingexcuses.com, and obviously listen to the podcast. Give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts if you can. And I think those are all the ways that you can support us. We really appreciate you, and thank you to everyone for coming.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Have a good night, y'all.